There's a teaching in the Jerusalem Talmud that asks the following question. What makes a person's religious practice foolish? What makes a person's religious practice foolish? The Talmud actually has more than one answer to that question, and among the answers is the following. One who sees a child bobbing up and down in the river and says, "Once I get my tefillin off, I will save them." By the time she removes her tefillin, the child will have drowned. I remember the first time I encountered this teaching. My first thought was, this is obvious. Whoever doesn't know this is missing the point of what Judaism is about. Now, knowing our community and the values that bring us together, I assume that most of you also think that this teaching is obvious. In communities like ours, where ritual observance is not necessarily the core or the only central tenet of what it means to be Jewish, the conflict between saving someone's life and ritual engagement is most likely not a major challenge. So why am I bringing this up today? Today's Haftarah from the book of Isaiah presents an approach that many of us will find familiar. The Haftarah begins with a call to rebuild the road, to remove any blocks or obstacles so that God's people can live in freedom. The prophet raised his voice crying out loud and clear that God does not desire the fasting of people engaged in oppression, and that religious ritual without moral action is meaningless. He then concludes by reminding us that through Shabbat we can get closer to the possibility of redemption. As I said, I think and hope that this teaching is obvious to us. A fast without showing up in the world to make the world better doesn't mean much. But in the context of Isaiah's life, this text is one of the most radical teachings our tradition offers regarding Yom Kippur. On a day focused on self-reflection by means of prayer and fast, we are told in no uncertain terms that we have a moral obligation to act in the world, and that our fast is meaningless if we do not listen to this message. This is the religion Isaiah teaches. Feed the hungry, clothe the naked, house the homeless, heal the wounded. In her TED Talk, "It's Time to Reclaim Religion," Rabbi Sharon Brous speaks out to the urgent need to revitalize religion. At the end of her talk, she says, "Our hearts hurt from the failed religion of extremism, and we deserve more than the failed religion of routinism. It is time for religious leaders and religious communities to take the lead in the spiritual and cultural shift that this country and the world so desperately needs. A shift towards love, towards justice, towards equality, and towards dignity for all." So what does God expect from us? Or what does our religion expect from us? Or what does being a religious person mean to us? Many of us feel uncomfortable labeling ourselves with the term religious. People often tell me in conversation, "I am not really religious. I come to shul, I am part of community, but I'm not religious." Mostly, what people mean is, I do not observe everything or most of what I was taught that Jewish tradition expect from us. How much of this discomfort is because the word religious, especially in our country, has a connotation of extremism, or because we think that religion is only about ritual obligation. How do we know what God wants from us? What is right? What happens when we get it wrong? When asking these questions, I often go back to the story of the golden calf in Exodus. The story of how the Israelite people created and worshiped an idol only 40 days after they had experienced the presence and revelation of God at Sinai. My first question about this story is why? Why do people who have just a couple of months ago been liberated by God from slavery in Egypt create this golden calf? Perhaps it can be explained as a response to fear related to that redemption. Moshe, their leader, the one who took them out of Egypt and saved them from Pharaoh, has not returned from the mountain. The people, for the first time since leaving Egypt, are without Moshe's physical presence. After being on the mountain for 40 days, the text tells us that Moshe in Hebrew, boshesh, which is to say, he was late. He was South American. So Moshe was late, seemingly later than the people could live with. And they became impatient, and then fearful, and then hopeless. And so they created something, however misguided, to help dampen their fear and possibly ignite hope. We often think of the sin of the golden calf as a rejection of God, but that in itself may be misguided, or rather, it is telling the story from the perspective of a hurt God, and not from the perspective of the people. The people of Israel do not reject God. They miss the relationship they have with God through the mediation of Moshe. So they decide to make a God for themselves. The sin of the golden calf is not that they choose to serve another God, but they attempted to serve God in a way that reflected their own anxiety and insecurities, rather than reflecting on the words God had spoken to them at Sinai. So if the sin of the golden calf is the paradigm of idolatry, it offers an understanding of that term that may be closer to our own contemporary experience. Idolatry is not necessarily choosing one God over another, or a stone god, or over an imagined one, but rather a critique of the gods we create in our own image, and of our choices regarding what we do in the name of God. In the name of God and religion, that person who witnessed a child drowning while adorned with tefillin might let that child die. Every day, individuals and communities act in the name of religion, of God, or of faith without realizing that they are confusing God for the golden calf. Sadly, throughout history, religion has been one of the important framings of human violence. And Judaism has not been exempt from this. Even in the past year, people burned villages and promoted hatred in the name of Judaism. That is the sin of the golden calf. That is the power of Isaiah. Isaiah says, don't fool yourself. Don't think that because you are a righteous person, that because you fast and prayed and beat your chest, everything you do is in the service of God. How do you know, asked Isaiah, that you are not creating a golden calf? How do we know? There's a wonderful teaching in the Talmud regarding the words that we just chanted a few minutes ago at the end of the Torah service, when we lifted the Torah and pointed to the scroll saying, Vezot HaTorah asher sam Moshe. This is the Torah which Moshe put before the children of Israel. אמר רבי יהושע בן לוי, says the Talmud, מהי דכתיב וזאת התורה אשר שם משה, זכה נעשית לו שם חיים, לא זכה נעשית לו שם מיתה. The word sam is written with the letter sin and means to put. But it sounds the same as the word sam, which is written with the letter samech and means a drug or a medicine. So with that in mind, this is how it will translate. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said, what is the meaning of this is the Torah which Moshe put, sam, before the children of Israel? If one merits, the Torah becomes a medicine, a sam, a potion of life. But if one does not merit, the Torah becomes a sam, a potion of death. The radical and self-evident point of this teaching is that Torah is dangerous. Everything depends on what we do with Torah. And if we accept it in ways that it becomes a blessing of life. No law, not even the law of the Torah, guarantees living a good life. In commenting on the verse of Leviticus, you should be holy as I am holy, the Ramban, a 13th century commentator, halachist, ethicist, and mystic, introduces the concept naval birshut haTorah, a person who is depraved while still being within Torah boundaries. He explains that it is quite possible to be an indecent person without technically transgressing any of the laws of Torah. The commandment to be holy is a response to this reality, a call to make personal choices in unregulated zones that will reflect our highest and best selves living in the presence of God. There may be times where it is extremely difficult to discern what living in the presence of God requires. In part, this is why not everything can be regulated. But Isaiah tells us that we can be certain that if our religion does not lead us to feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, housing the homeless, and caring for the sick, we are worshiping an idol. Fasting and pounding your chest does not mean much without understanding that our obligation, what God wants from us, is to care for the world. I am not calling us to set aside the practices of Torah and mitzvot, nor did the Ramban. Held individually and in community, they can create the scaffolding for a life of holiness. But we, liberal, progressive Jews, need to reclaim Isaiah's certainty. We need to reclaim his deep conviction of the goal and purposes of religious life. We need to see that goal in our Torah and not leave Torah and religion to others who hide their idolatrous choices behind a mask of authenticity. My prayer and hope today is that each and every one of us can find in the path of Torah an opening for religious life, that we know and learn to emulate God's compassion in the world, that we know to find in our religious practice a path for compassion and love, the path within which Torah opens the doors for a better world. Gmar Chatima Tova.